We have the really great pleasure to have Joscha Bach. Who doesn't need any introduction really. Arguably a very unique mind and one in a million. So I think water, all for Joscha. Thank you. Yeah. So Joscha is going to talk about from AI alignment to AGI ethics. AGI ethics, wow. Going to be exciting, so please.
So I didn't know what exactly you would be most interested in, and I also don't know how many of you had been to the ASSC conference before, so I thought I'm not going to maximize the overlap there, and I'm going to talk about crazy ideas. And when you want to go in a different direction or interrupt me or have opinions or whatever, please feel free to shift this into a different direction. First of all, I see artificial intelligence as a philosophical project. Of course, 99% of AI is applied data processing and philosophically not super interesting, but the way the field was started and intended was really to figure out how the mind works, and this always has been an important part of the field. And I think that AI is in many ways in the tradition of these thinkers that thought about how to naturalize the mind, how to figure out how it works, how to translate it into representational causal structure. And the basic idea is that the mind can be treated as a mathematical object are quite old, and they're well formulated in some sense in the work of Leibniz, Lamettrie, later Frege, and many others, and Wittgenstein, would build a tradition of thinking around understanding the mind as a mathematical system. When we do philosophy, it's very hard to say something true because philosophy is mostly done in natural language. And if you try to say something in mathematics, you can say things that are true because truth is defined within mathematics in a formal way. But mathematics is very simple. Mathematical languages are very basic, so it's very hard to say something about the world in mathematics and about our experience and how we relate to the world. And so in some sense, if we want to get philosophy and mathematics to meet, we have to build up mathematics to such a degree that we can automate what the mind is doing. We have to basically treat AI as the missing link between AI and philosophy. And Western culture has this big issue with the so-called hard problem of consciousness that David Chalmers has famously branded. And I think that the hard problem indicates the metaphysical problem that especially Western science has. And I think it's difficult for us to understand from the perspective of the Western scientific worldview other perspectives in which no hard problem exists, because we have difficulty translating the metaphysics from, say, an animist culture or from a Confucian culture or from a shamanic culture or framework into the Western framework, because we do not have a metaphysics that allows us to perform the translation between metaphysics, and we are largely unaware of our own metaphysics. We don't discuss metaphysics very much in the scientific culture. And so I think that AI has to deliver concepts at the metaphysical level as well, and interestingly, it can. So different cultures use different terminology to describe physical and psychological reality, and I think that the hard problem relates to the difficulty to identify what's psychological and what's physical. And our Western culture has some gaps in its ontology, in the order of what things exist and what relationship they have to each other. Aristotle himself, who is arguably at the beginning of the Western tradition, did not seem to have a hard problem. When he talks about the mind, he does talk about a lot of the details of many categories that we are now using, but he didn't seem to have an issue with seeing consciousness as something that had to be explained using completely novel metaphysics. Instead, I think that Aristotle was an animist. He saw the mind, the psyche, as a structure that is causally imprinting itself on the physical universe, and in some sense like a software that is organizing the physical universe. And I think that the main confusion in our own culture comes because we think that consciousness is a real object, and real objects are physical objects. But physical objects cannot be experienced. Neuron cannot experience anything, it's just a mechanism. A brain cannot experience anything. Instead, you can only be conscious in the dream. Consciousness is a virtual experience. It exists as if. It can still have causal power in the sense it is implemented. It's not a physical object, it's a representational object. And all experiential objects are representations. In the physical world, you cannot visit it. You cannot be conscious in physics. Physics is some weird domain that you can describe as arcane mathematics, but it's not the world that we experience. The world that we experience is the dream generated in our neocortex. The colors, sounds, people, expressions, and so on that we experience are themselves not physical, they are representational. And the representation of reality that we have is a trance. And this means that we are experiencing reality from the self, and the self normally does not experience that it's just a representation. But we can deconstruct this immediacy of representation, for instance, through meditation. And then at some point we realize that both the self and the world that we experience, including our emotions and so on, our meanings that we have, are representations. I suspect that consciousness is possibly a learning algorithm. What we observe is that consciousness is something that we do not obtain at the end of our intellectual career. We have it before we can track a finger. And the fact that all of us are conscious and that we cannot learn anything while not being conscious, and that if we don't become conscious at the beginning of our intellectual career as babies, we remain vegetables, brings me to suggest that consciousness might be more basic, more simple than the high-level functions that we have, rather than the most advanced thing that maybe only the human brain possesses. It might be something that's quite ubiquitous in nature. Maybe it is the simplest way to train a self-organizing learning system. What I mean by consciousness is, first of all, when I appointed it as second-order perception going on. It's not just that you're aware of content, but you're aware of the fact that you are aware of the content. You're establishing yourself as the observer. So it's not just perception, it's second-order perception, perceiving of perceiving. The other thing is consciousness always happens now. Consciousness is observing now, and it is creating possibly now. It's inhabiting a bubble of nowness. It's basically a curve where you can fit, or an area where you can fit a curve to your sensory data and the things that you perceive to be currently the case. So I suspect that consciousness could be a biological learning algorithm that is optimizing for coherence rather than next token prediction. And you might be able to test this by building machine learning systems that work on a self-organizing substrate. We can, for instance, create a self-organizing layer on GPUs, and then see if you can discover an operator that is able to colonize the substrate with a shared language, with a shared reward system, and then trains itself onto the substrate to perform learning tasks, for instance, sequence processing, prediction tasks. So if this theory is correct, I would express this theory like this. Consciousness is creating a self-perpetuating, intelligent, recurrent information transformer, which we can abbreviate as spirit. It's basically a self-organizing software agent that consciousness seems to be creating on our brain. And it acts, the spirit, as an operating system for our brain or for an organism or even for an entire ecosystem. So there's three elements here. Self-organization, which means that we build structure from the inside out, rather than the way in which we as an engineer build systems. We build them from the outside in. We start with a substrate that we fully understand, for instance, our GPUs or CPUs, or an empty table, a workbench on which we have full control over what we want to do. And then we build structure from the outside in into the system, and thereby extend our own world into that substrate. And in biology, this happens in a different way. In a biological system, you need to construct everything from the inside out. If you want to become a tree, you need to start as a seedling that is colonizing its environment, that is turning the chaotic structure of its environment into more tree. And so you need to look for a pattern that is self-reinforcing, that is growing, that wants to become the function that it eventually implements. And it does so in an energy-optimizing way. When you are colonizing a substrate, it means that you are extracting more energy than the administration costs. And the second one is software. Software means you have a causal structure that exists as a pattern in physical reality. And that causal structure is virtual. It exists as if it's an object that you can see from when you project reality in a particular way, so this pattern becomes apparent. And the pattern itself can be an invariance, so it can be the thing that actually matters. In the same way, when you look at your phone, the software that runs on it, you do not really care about the number of transistors that you have on your computer memory on your phone. You care about the causal pattern that's implemented on it. And the causal pattern needs to be organized in such a way that it's able to recruit the functionality that it needs from its substrate. And the second one, it's an agent. An agent is a control system not just for the present, like a thermostat, but for the future. It's a system that is making preferences over future trajectories. And to do this, it needs to have a model of available futures and the influences that its actions will have on the future. So the control system for future states is the simplest definition of agent that I found. If you build a control system for future states, you get things like beliefs, desires, and intentions falling out of that definition. So there's really a big difference between how we currently build AI with this outside-in design that's stabilized on a deterministic stuff that has no choice about what it's doing. You are, as the engineer, forcing it to do whatever you want. And when we build these systems, we decouple them from the world, train them on static data using machine learning algorithms that mostly optimize for minimizing a prediction error. And when we compare this to biological systems, they are self-organizing from the inside out. They're coupled with the environment all the time. They're dynamical. And they seem to be optimizing for coherence. And I think we might be able to define coherence as the minimization of constraint violations, like a consensus algorithm. So the more coherent the system it becomes, the better it's able to implement its agentic functionality, the more energy it is able to extract or liberate from its environment. And so coherence might be a slightly different loss function that biology has discovered. So if consciousness is indeed the thing that is organizing information processing in our brains, if it's actually a pattern that our brain discovers very early on in its development to structure itself into a coherent organization, maybe there is some similar principles that exist across other cells in our body. And it's a theory that, for instance, Mike Levin has discovered and is exploring. According to Mike Levin, if you take a paper in neuroscience about mental development or brain development, and you exchange milliseconds for days or months or weeks, and you exchange neurons by cells, then you get a developmental paper. And what we notice when we look at individual cells, that they can do most of the things that neurons can do from the perspective of computer scientists, which means they can send conditional messages to other cells, and they can learn the conditions under which they are sending cells. And this means that from the perspective of a computer scientist, every large organism is going to be some kind of Turing machine across all the cells. And under evolutionary conditions, there is nothing obvious that would stop them from discovering how to learn and make models of reality. And so the thing that makes neurons special is that they're basically telegraph cells. They have evolved to send signals very quickly through an organism of an animal, so you can move your muscles at the limit of physics and can compete with other animals. It's very hard to run these telegraph cells because they need a lot of energy to run. And also you need to invent some kind of code that is stable over long distances. Like in the telegraph system, when this was invented in human societies, we discovered Morse code, which is basically transmitting the messages into the temporal domains as individual blips. And a similar thing seems to have happened in neurons, that have basically discovered a code that is made out of blips that are mapped into the temporal domain and are stable over long distances. Versus if you are just wanting to send messages to neighboring cells, you can use electricity, you can use mechanical stimulation, you can use all sorts of chemicals like RNA and so on that you diffuse over your membrane into the neighboring cell. But of course this doesn't work over long distances. But it also means that if neurons are indeed telegraph cells, that the current paradigm of neuroscience might be flawed. The idea that you can understand the information processing of organisms by looking at neurons and neurons alone might lead to problems. Imagine that you are an alien that looks at human civilization around 1920 or so 100 years ago when people were still using telegraphs. And you try to understand the economy of human societies using these telegraphs, you will see there's a huge correlation between the information processing of society and the messages on the telegraph network. But if you're only looking at the telegraphs and you try to run them in a computer simulation, you're not going to get something that actually works. Because the people who operate the telegraphs and the environment of these telegraphs is very, very important for understanding what they're doing. In the same way, there are probably cells around the neurons that are supplying some important functionality that is crucial for the way in which nervous systems work. And maybe this is the reason why our simulations of connectomes, even for simple cases like C. elegans, don't actually work so far. It might be an incomplete model. But again, it's a theory. I don't know whether that's true. It's just when I look at as a computer scientist at what neuroscientists are doing, I suspect that I might be missing something. But if we accept the possibility that all cells can process information, and large multicellular organisms exist for long enough to evolve structured, intelligent information processing across many cells, it might mean that plants might also have spirits, right? And it's not just nervous systems that develop these self-organizing information processing agents on them, but plants also have software running on them. Actually, we find quite a bit of evidence for this, right? When we look into the information processing of trees, if you harm the foliage or the roots of a tree, you see information processing going back and forth and sending information across the plant, and the plant is going to develop more or less coherent response to that thing happening. Of course, it's much, much slower than in an animal, but it also makes sense that it doesn't need to be much faster because the plant is not able to locomote very fast. And so it doesn't need to have information processing that is as fast as the information processing of animals. There's also some evidence for communication across plants. The problem is when you are growing next to another plant and you spend all your life there, how are you going to evolve a firewall against the other plant sending information through you? So imagine there is the tree and there's a fungus growing next to the tree, and this tree is building information highway to send information across its roots and to its.
Can I ask one?
Yes?
So when you say consciousness can override emotional processing in brains, to the same principle of process.
Yes.
I thought you're saying that consciousness state is emergent phenomenon of neural cells, but so you're not saying this. So consciousness came from somewhere, and
No.
that dominates neural cells.
I don't know if consciousness is discovered or infected. I suspect that it's discovered. It's an operator that our brain is discovering relatively early on.
But so you're not saying that this consciousness is an emergent phenomenon from the population of cells?
So emergence is a tricky word, because a lot of people think that emergence is some kind of magic. I think it's a relationship between different description systems. So you could say that government is emerging over society, but also societies are emerging over governance. But what is government? Government is a principle. It's the principle of recursively bullying people. If you get a large group of people together, for a few generations, they will discover governance.
Mm.
Right? Somebody will figure out the secret of recursively bullying people.
Okay, fine.
And then society gets colonized. Right?
Yeah,
And it gets colonized until it bumps against another government.
Actually, so I think Joscha is pursuing the possibility that neural networks are not the only place where consciousness happens, right? I mean,
once when we say emergent phenomena, so we have to think about what kind of property in a basic level.
yeah. So I think that's
That's why I didn't use the word emergence at all. That it was deliberate that I didn't use it, because I think that emergence is a very tricky phenomenon for philosophers. But what does emergence actually mean? It means that something becomes apparent when you zoom out. But is the thing that is apparent when you zoom out a real thing or not? For instance, I think that waves in an ocean are not real. Right? And if you zoom into the ocean, you have water molecules that push and pull against each other, and that's it. It's only because you cannot observe these molecules individually because there are too many. When you zoom out, you get these apparent patterns, which are the waves in the ocean. But if you want to understand the causal structure in the ocean, you need to understand the molecules. And on the other hand, if you look, for instance, at money, is money an emergent phenomenon in society? Or is it just is it an apparent phenomenon? I don't think it's just an apparent phenomenon. If you pretend that money doesn't exist, there are a lot of things that you can no longer understand. Right? So money is actually a causal system that is in some sense emergent over society, but yet is, it performs causal things on the people.
I understand that, right? But because my background is physics, so emergent, I'm not using that ambiguous way of defining emergence.
So how do you use it here?
So there is a cooperative phenomenon between the basic elements, right? And then elements have some properties, for example, like in brain systems that we say that excitable media might be responsible for having this kind of emergent phenomenon.
Yes.
But if it's not, then maybe there's no such thing that appears in the macro level. So we try to understand what kind of property in the basic elements that can have certain property of the macro phenomena to come out, right? For example, like how the fluctuations emphasized when they interact in this way or other way, right? So
there's an interesting phenomenon in physics that I like, which is the phenomenon of a quasi-particle. For instance, if you look at phonons, the phonon is the particle of sound. And phonons are a very interesting phenomenon. If you think what is sound, actually, it's just air molecules bounce against each other, right? Or it could be, it can also exist in solid objects or in liquids. But what's the difference between sound and heat? Because heat is also air molecules bouncing against each other. Right? So basically heat is turbulent and is not producing a recognizable signal that you can extract on the other side, whereas sound is a pattern that is replicating itself. It's reproducing itself in a stable way. And so sound has some interesting properties. For instance, it's quantized. And
again, going to the
right?
very difficult question, but that's okay. Yeah.
Yes.
I take
So
your point, yeah.
I think that consciousness can be slightly metaphorically understood as something like a quasi-particle. It's basically a pattern that is self-stabilizing on the brain, and it is also a colonizing pattern. It's one that is spreading. Once it's there, like government, it is spreading and entrenching itself in the substrate that it is in. So once it's discovered, it's a pattern that is in some sense error-correcting and self-stabilizing. And it is an invariance, so it has causal power that is able to structure its substrate. So if you were to take a bunch of neurons that are compatible with your brain and glue them to your brain and you wait for a while, you will see that the structure of this lump of neurons is going to change and become compatible with the rest of that tissue, right? Or if you are injecting a bunch of people that are not very opinionated into a new society, then they will get assimilated into this society. And so there is an invariant pattern working on a society that is structuring the society. And in a similar way, you could think that the structure of organisms is built like this. It's built by invariant software that exists on the organisms.
Yeah, so please do go on if you...
Yes.
Yeah.
So if plants cannot build firewalls against each other, then it might be possible for a fungus to send signals to a tree and vice versa. And we have evidence for that happening. There's long-range communication in forests. And so over a long enough time span, there will be something like the internet growing in the forest. And this leads to a very interesting situation, because if your mind is a self-organizing software, or if a mind is a spirit is a self-organizing software that is able to live on the protocol layer of a plant, and plants have very similar protocols across a forest, this means that they can build some feedback loops to other plants and become somewhat mobile in the forest. And this idea is something that our ancestors in Europe were believed in, that we have that basically there are forest spirits that exist in the forest. They exist in different time frames, which means that there's the old fairy tales in Europe say that one day in fairyland is 7 years in human land. There are several orders of magnitude time difference in the way information processing happens, and that they basically can move around in the forest and have their own agendas. So this might lead to a situation where you have an complex ecosystems of self-organizing information processing agents in biological information processing systems that are not just identical to the physical organisms that you're observing, but it might also exist across organisms. And this might sound outlandish at first, but also society is like that, right? Society itself has a spirit, it has software running on it, it has ideas on it that move a lot of people and shift them around and make them behave in a coordinated manner, and make them extract more energy from the environment than they otherwise could by producing coherent organization across people. And we see this starting from binary relationships when we find a partner, and then building families, and then building villages and circles of friends and societies. So if consciousness can organize information processing in brains by optimizing for coherence, maybe we find similar principles across all other cells and then of systems across cells. And this basically allows us to talk about this weird word spirit that Western science has lost after we basically dropped Christianity out of our worldview, and spirit became a completely superstitious notion. And so Western science currently tries to explain the entire world through mechanisms. And mechanisms are thought to be physical, and this leads to this weird hard problem. But if we basically take the ideas of computer science seriously and realize that software is actually a causal power that can have invariance, and they can also be self-organizing in nature, and software exists in nature, and nature is full of software, then we will introduce the notion of spirit into the scientific worldview. And it leads us to the question of whether we can build AIs that are compatible with the way in which information processing works in nature. By the way, during my talk at the ASSC conference, I ended with a slide that gives some recognition of Hayao Miyazaki, who I believe is a very under-recognized philosopher, at least for most people, because they're not really aware of the fact that he is a philosopher. But I think he's actually the most important living humanist philosopher today, and also animist philosopher, which becomes apparent when you are watching, for instance, his most recent movie, How to Live, or Boy with the Heron in the English version, which is, unfortunately, he publishes mostly only in movies. So it's not part of the discourse of philosophers. On the other hand, the discourse of philosophers is largely useless these days. So maybe you can get more by sitting down and talking to him and reflecting on his perspective on animism. Anyway, what spirits are allowing to do, they basically lead to state-building agents. And so a bunch of cells build an organism that is made out of individual cells that become multicellular in some sense is the result of state-building agency. Right? Our organism is very much a state of single-celled animals. And a famous example, of course, is the social insects, and humanity itself is also a state-building organism in its present form. And our society of mind, as Minsky calls it, might also be seen as something like a state of different agents that are forming in our own mind and become coherent and build coherent agency. And if you look at the architecture of our own mind, I think it looks roughly like this. In our current understanding, we have a world model, which is a game engine that is tracking your perceptual data. And this is what you perceive as stuff in space. Descartes calls it res extensa and confused it with physics, but it's not physics. It's a representation inside of our own mind that allows us to see this space, to see windows, to see people, to see lights, and so on. And then we have a personal self. This is a model into which our perception is being projected. And we have conscious attention as that interface of us being an agent that perceives the world and deals with it. And this personal self is also driven by our emotional motivation that are all computed in the mind being that protocol layer that establishes itself on your brain and is producing, for instance, models of your own alignment to the world and of your where you are currently in the world and what you're doing with it. Our own emotions, if you look at them, they are usually projected into the body map and we experience them in our body. There is a lot of invariance in the way in which people perceive emotions. Emotions are configuring our own self. We experience them not as parameters of our mind, but as unconditional reaction, things that we have in our psyche. Basically, our self is downstream from our emotion. It basically gets configured by the emotion. And typically people will perceive safety and control and connectedness to others and social control and the current degree of lucidity, how awake they are, and so on in different regions in their body. And this allows us to disambiguate them. It also makes sense that they would be geometric because they're not computed by our symbolic mind, they're not computed analytically, but they are computed by non-symbolic parts of our mind, which means they have to be geometric. They have to be made out of floating point numbers that basically by combining multiple dimensions you get a space. In the space you experience expansion and contraction and so on. So they are all geometric representations combined with valence, which means good or bad. So we have multiple dimensions of valence in our emotional system. And this model of that we just saw is very similar to how Sigmund Freud saw the mind. So he basically has marital perception and gets filtered through conscious attention. Then we have our ego, which is a model of what we want to be doing, and this is the superego, which is our model of what we should be doing. And there's also a lot of similarity between Freud's model and the Greek model of the mind. But there's also a big difference. Right? The Greek model of the mind is assuming that your mind is made out of components that don't have an identity. It means they're not local to you only. This notion of identity is quite interesting. It seems to be central to Western philosophy, or the way in which we see things, that they are identical with themselves. But identity is actually just a cognitive property that we use to model things. It means we assign to multiple object instances a shared biography. Right? So when I, for instance, say that this bottle is actually a princess, I can represent this identity effortlessly in my mind. It means not that they share any features, right? This doesn't look like a princess at all. It cannot talk. It doesn't look like it's a royalty. But we can represent this in our mind as them sharing a biography. Of course, we might have to, when we want to explain why this is a princess, maybe there was an evil witch who changed all the features of the princess so they can share a biography, and the princess is now a bottle. But identity is a representation of a shared identity. That's it. It's just a shared world life. It's a shared biography of objects. And if we think of the individual modules of our mind in the Western psychology, we think of them as part of ourselves. So my anger is part of me. In the Greek philosophy, anger is nothing that's specific to me. You all have capability for anger, And when anger manifests in your own mind, it is pushing you out, right? When you take completely over by the anger, then it's less of you there and more of the anger. And so the anger is nothing specific to you, but of course the degree to which you are susceptible to anger is different. So there's different amounts of anger on different minds. And in the same way, you can basically take personality away, but the anger itself is not an agent, because the anger doesn't have a biography across people. If you want to give it a biography, you need to build a temple for it, right? And if you combine multiple properties like anger into one thing, you get a Greek god. They're all archetypes that are built as dimensions in this space of psychological properties. So the Greeks were basically thinking about what is the eigenspace of psychology, and then they built a three-dimensional space, and then for each 3 dimensions they create an entity, and then they build temples around those entities, which they call gods. It's quite interesting, but these gods are also a model of individual psychology. They are all aspects of our psyche. And this leads us to the notion of gods, right? Your personal self is an entity that runs on your brain, on your mind, and your mind alone, right? I am possessed by an entity that calls itself Joscha Bach, thinks of itself as a human being, has a voice that it uses for monologues in my head and so on, and is controlling the organism. But there is no reason to think that there should only be one entity on the brain. It's possible that you can have multiple entities on your brain. And if these entities are shared across people, we call them gods. So technically a god is a multi-mind self. And since our personal self is not physically real but virtual, exists as if, of course these gods are also not more real than personal selves, but also not less real. So these multi-mind selves can use a superset of your own functionality. They might even be able to generate emotions on our mind and perception, and in this way manipulate the personal self if they're implemented in this way. But gods are not physical entities. And Western world is confused about this because of Christianity, because Christianity largely teaches people that there was a God, that was a supernatural entity that created the physical universe in the first place. And that's not compatible with any sound epistemology, but being supernatural means it's more real than physics. And it's actually less real, it's a software when we talk about gods in this sense. Julian Jaynes has written a famous book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And I think the title is a little bit unfortunate because it should be called The Origin of the Personal Self and the Breakdown of the Polytheist Mind. What he describes in this book is the polytheist society, the Sumerians. It's his personal theory after having studied the Sumerians for a long time. And he identifies them as a society in which all people have not just their personal self running on their brain, but have multiple entities running on their brain that are overlapping and that are instrumental in organizing a scalable society. So for instance, when you want to do the harvest in an agricultural society, you cannot just be a tribe, because you need more than 120 people or so that you can maintain a tribe using a reputation system. You might have to have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people that you want to coordinate. And to do this, they need to have some kind of shared identity. And the shared identity can be provided by having a multi-mind self installed of them. In this case, a harvest entity. So people have a harvest idol in their personal altar at home in their shrine, and there is a harvest temple, and everybody is supposed to participate in the harvest, is supposed to pray to this entity around the right time of the year, and the priests are going to make the ceremonies and processions in the city, and the harvest entity wakes up and talks with a voice on the heads of their people and coordinates the activity. And Julian Jaynes studied scriptures from this society and describes the psychology of people being compatible with being run by such entities. And then later there's a breakdown of that society in which people suddenly feel that they're alone, that the gods are leaving them, that there was some kind of revolution in society that perhaps eradicated the temples or so, and that led to the breakdown of that polytheist society and people being alone on their heads and then having to coordinate via some kind of code that they developed is based on their personal identity. So this is the theory that Julian Jaynes has developed, but it's very interesting to think of this model, what it looks like, right? You have your personal self, these blue bubbles in your mind, and then you have a bunch of different gods that exist across people and need to be organized. And there's still a polytheist society in the world, right? Hinduism is essentially polytheist, and there are wars in the history of this society that are basically about these entities fighting over which people they control. until they form some kind of somewhat stable pantheon. And Abrahamic religion, starting with the Hebrew tradition, has changed this. So Abrahamic tradition starts out with this notion there's only one God that you're allowed to have. And if you read this text, it's not the claim that there is only one God in the universe. No, there are many, many gods, but you're allowed to have only one. Right? You're not allowed to let any gods in your mind but one. And it's our tribal God, the God of Abraham. And there is a hierarchy in a society of rabbis that are organized in such a way that the will of God can get coordinated through a rational discourse in a society. So you basically can distribute the will of God across people, and God is the spirit of this Hebrew society. It's basically a shared mind that exists across the tribe and organizes them into a much more efficient unit, especially for war. And this religion has been forked multiple times. It's basically a tribal software that has been forked into Christianity, into Islam, and Orthodoxy. And they are all religions that use the same blueprint, but slightly different aesthetics for this design of this collective psychological entity. So if you ask ourselves whether gods are real or not, right, after we eradicated Christianity, most Westerners started to believe, at least if they were in the sciences, that God was always a superstition and that God is not real. But the idea that God is not real is pretty tall talk from somebody who is also not real, because there is simulation by the brain, right? My own person, my personal self, is a story that my brain tells itself about what it would be like if there was a person. I am not real, I only exist virtually. And in the same sense, the gods of the Christian traditions are also, of course, virtual entities that exist across minds, but they're just virtual entities. They're slightly different from the notion of God that the preeminent philosopher of Western Christianity, of Catholicism, developed, which is Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas was a rationalist. If you read his books, he doesn't have any kind of mystery experience. He's trying to be logically sound. He's very nerdy. And he sees society as a multi-agent system. And he thinks about how to coordinate a multi-agent system, and he recognizes God as a collective entity that gets collectively enacted. And God is defined as the best possible entity that can logically exist. Right? So it's a logical specification that he comes up with God. And this logical specification can be discovered through rational inference. So it cannot be discovered just by listening to some guy who says, it's my tribe, and therefore you have to have that entity, and this entity is just the way it is. But it's an abstract idea that is to be designed by the best thinkers of a civilization. It's an open-ended process that is ongoing, and he tries to take a shot at trying to find out what defines such an entity. And what he comes up with is sustainability, in the sense of the entity that is able to play the longest game, which is, I think, a pretty good start. So when we see society as a multi-agent system in which individuals are rational, which means that they have reasons for their beliefs, that they can justify to themselves and to each other, then rational agents should observe some policies which fall out of you being rational. And these apply to all rational agents because they can all be individually inferred. And so, for instance, you should optimize your internal organization. So you should exercise enough, you should not eat food that makes you sick, you should not do drugs that destroy you, and so on. And he calls this optimization of the internal organization of an agent temperance. You should also optimize your organization across agents. And that's what he calls justice. And then you should justify your own goals and strategies rationally, and that's what he calls prudence. And then you should be willing to act on your models. You should have skin in the game, have the right balance between exploration and exploitation. And this willingness to act on your models is what he calls courage. And these policies, what he calls practical virtues, apply to every rational agent, regardless of whether they are pro-social or not. So even if you are just a single-celled agent that is smart in a society, you should live by these rules. But if you want to organize society in such a way that you have more than transactional relationships, that you have some kind of collective spirit that emerges, you need to have more policies. And these policies for collective agency is what he calls divine virtues. And first of all, you should commit to serving the best possible collective agent, and he calls that faith. And you cannot just do this alone. You also need to do this with others that serve the same sacredness. And sacredness here means the stuff that you're willing to sacrifice your ego for, that is more important than your ego. The ego being the function that integrates your personal expected reward over the next 50 years or so, But this collective thing that you're willing to sacrifice your ego for, when you discover this in the others, discovery of shared sacredness, that's what he calls love. So love is discovery of sacredness in the other. And you need to be willing to invest into this thing before it exists, because otherwise it cannot come into existence, right? So when it exists, it's going to give you all sorts of rewards. You're going to have a harmonic society that can give you roads and hospitals and all sorts of useful infrastructure. But to bring it into existence, you need to be willing to invest into it before it exists. And that's what he calls hope. So he comes up with these policies and this entirely rational system of having a society that is built around rationally reflected multi-agency. So in this total monotheism of Aquinas, God is the best possible, most top-level collective agent. And for Aquinas in Christianity, God is the transcendental agency that is not immanent, which means it's not here yet. The world that we live in, according to Christians, is not perfect. It's very messy. People are horrible for the most part. The world is ugly, full of pain and suffering. And so the idea of this best possible agent is something that can only exist after some fundamental phase transition of the world. Maybe we need to build AGI and assimilate everybody or so. And the other thing is, from this perspective of the best possible agent, we can answer the question of morality, what should be done. And monotheism answers this question of what should be done. What does God want us to do? So from the perspective of the best possible collectively enacted agent, what would that agent want us to do? Right? This is the traditional foundation of morality in the West, but it broke a little bit down after we got rid of Christianity, and then we tried to find other systems. I find it very interesting to compare this to Japanese society. And well, not Japanese, and only see this from a very far distance from the outside and know very little about it. My impression is that Japanese society is spiritually quite different from the West. In that Japanese society is not only on an animist foundation, which means it recognizes that the world is full of spirit and that humanity itself is some sort of spirit in it, collectively and individually, but that society itself is an organism. And that this organism has a collective enacted agency, and the spirituality of the religion of Japanese society is not Buddhism, which I think was imported for optimizing bureaucracy at some point, but not to teach people, but it's society itself. And Shintoism reflects this to some degree. So basically, my sense is when people are bowing to each other in Japanese society, they're not just playing out a protocol, but they also express to some degree a spiritual commitment to the interaction in society. And so basically the religion in Japan appears to me to be immanentist, which means it is about the thing that exists and that has to be improved and perpetuated, versus Christianity in the West is about something that is beyond what exists, and that the present system can only approximate to a very poor degree. So there is something that is fundamentally different in the collective psychology, I feel. Anyway, after the West got rid of Christianity, we tried to rederive ethics, and most of these schools of ethics are some versions of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was a project by multiple philosophers, Rawls and so on, who tried to rederive ethics. And they never got it finished to their lifetime. And later generations of philosophers thought by teaching what the others have figured out, they now have ethics, but they don't, because it's an unfinished project. The problem is that utilitarianism is trying to derive ethics by, in some sense, finding a metric for what's good, what's desirable, by utility. And so they try to maximize an aggregated expected reward over many agents over some time span, and usually by putting some kind of metric on hedonic states. I remember when I was at the Media Lab, we had a class on mindfulness, and the director of the Media Lab, Joe Ito, gave a talk on eudaimonia and what life, and said that the most important thing in life is happiness. It's in the Constitution, even in the US, and every nation on earth, and every person would at some level strive for happiness. And I said, no, I'm German. We are after efficiency, not happiness. And most of my friends are Eastern European Jews, and they're after meaning. And let me tell you, that's not happy. Another issue with utilitarianism is the so-called utility monster. The utility monster is a hypothetical entity that subjectively derives enormous amounts of utility from its existence more than I can derive from my own existence, so logically I should serve it, even if it's useless beyond the utility that it perceives for itself. And so the difficulty is to define utility in some objective sense. And this falls especially apart when you look at minds that are mutable, when you can just change your hedonic states at will, because you realize that how you feel about yourself and the world is not the result of what the universe is doing to your physical body, but it's happening at the boundary between your world model and your self model. Right? How you experience the world to be depends on what you expect it to be, on your alignment to the world, and it's inside of your mind. All the suffering is generated inside of your brain. It's just electrical impulses interpreted in a particular way. And when you learn to interpret them any way you want, then a lot of the concepts that exist in many utilitarian attempts to define ethics fall apart. And the same thing is true when you look at non-human minds. It's very difficult to define utilitarian ethics across different types of minds. And that's also true for AGI. So once we learn to change our mind, once we learn to change our own source code, and once we have minds that are intelligent and sentient, able to experience themselves in the interaction with the world and have meaning and goals and so on, these concepts of ethics do not work very well anymore. And so I think if we want to build an ethics that works across minds, especially for AI minds, for artificial minds that we might be creating that could be superhumanly intelligent, I think it's important to think about whether we can have an ethics that works with this. And I think it might require that the AGI is recognizing the thing that is most important to us as valuable. And I think the thing that is most important to us might be consciousness. The fact that we are bipedal or that we look like hairless monkeys and so on is not as important to us as the fact that we are conscious. And so if this thing that we are conscious beings that experience themselves from this consciousness and create our own identity based on being conscious, if the AI is to recognize this, it might require that the AI has an equivalent of that. Next thing is, can AI have shared purposes with us? Can we construct non-human sentient systems that are able to have shared purposes at the above level of the ego, so we can have shared ethics with them? And so this gets us to this question, can we build AGI that serves collective agency? Many of you probably know this diagram. Who does? Who's seen it before? This is a cartoon that somebody made, and it is related to a notion brought up by Lovecraft, who was a very B-movie author before movies. It's basically a horror author who described the elder gods. They are abominable spirits that exist in underground dimensions and haunt Earth over a very long distance to reap all the souls. And their own sentience is completely orthogonal to our own, and their own morality is orthogonal to our own. It's completely incomprehensible to humans. And these eldritch horrors is, in some sense, what the unsupervised learning is producing in an LLM according to this model, which means that this model might look like to you something that is looks human or so, but it's anything, and it's very different from the way in which we conceptualize the world. So it has no shared morality with us in the way it's being trained. And then on top of this eldritch horror, the foundation model, we build supervised fine-tuning, and this gives you some semblance of humanity, and then we have LHF, the cherry on top, that gives you a friendly interface on top of it. And it's an idea on how horrible the current AI alignment actually is, and how incomplete and how little you can train these systems. And I think there is some truth to this. And it leads a lot of people to be very scared of the future of AI. There's this notion of AI doom. It's very likely that the AI is going to turn us all into paperclips or worse, and that AI is precipitating near certain doom. The doomers have by now formed something like a doomsday cult, similar to the Extinction Rebellion for climate change. And the point of a doomsday cult is not necessarily that their ideas of doom are built on bad arguments or that they're wrong, but that their psychological state is one of terror, and that the individuals that are driven by this terror are forming a community that leads the individual to do things that are counterproductive, that will drive them deeper into the community, but will lead them to behavior that is not actually averting the doom. Right? So you see this when people are trying to fight climate change by defacing public artwork. They basically just make everybody angry at them. They're not actually preventing climate change. And what is actually happened in these organizations, that at the top you have a few sociopaths who are able to model the outcomes of the actions of these young people and realize that if they drive these individuals to perform actions that alienate them from the rest of society, then it drives them deeper into the cult, which means it gives higher status and power to the cult leaders and resources and drives that movement. And a similar thing is something that we currently see in the AI doom movement. So we have a bunch of people who are really scared of AI, and they, as a result, they perform actions that are counterproductive, that don't lead to AI that is necessarily safer. And as a counterpoint to the AI doom movement, we now have effective accelerationism. And effective accelerationism is in some sense the belief that the paperclip maximizer and Rocco's bacillus, the thing that is going to haunt you for all your afterlife and torture you if you prevent AI from happening, are just going to balance each other, that by building more different AIs, they're going to fight against each other and keep each other busy and will be at each other's throats for all eternity. And as a side effect, we get all the paperclips we need and a good afterlife and so on. There's also this notion that maybe we can build an AGI for Gaia. Maybe we can build planetary intelligence that is merging with life in a benevolent way, and we basically get hyper Gaia that is bringing us in the future, that is going to solve global warming, that is able to find a place in which humanity can coexist with life on Earth, which humanity currently doesn't have. Right? If we look at humanity the way it is organized right now, we are probably doomed. AI is possibly able to change that. Personally, I'm somewhat optimistic with respect to AI itself. I'm not so much worried, for instance, about misinformation due to AI, because AI is fundamentally a technology to solve problems through better information. And so I think by deploying AI, we can solve the problems that AI is creating. For instance, misinformation is going to be fought by epistemological AI that allows us to evaluate which information is reliable, what the trust chains are, which individuals are reliable in giving you information, which pictures have been taken by real cameras that have been certified using a trust chain, and so on. And in this way, we will be able to build systems that extend our individual epistemology, our ability to discover what's true and what's false, beyond what's currently available. And this allows us to interact much more deeply and meaningfully with each other. And I think that because cooperation in every society is better incentivized than defection, because you can build more by cooperating than by destroying, I think that AI will largely be used for good. And the way to stop a bad guy with an AI is 10 good people with an AI. So I think a near-term goal for us is going to be to build epistemological AI. What that means is, at the moment you are only at the beginning confronted with deepfakes. And this is going to get much worse. In a few years from now, if you don't do anything about it, if you answer your phone and you hear the voice of a loved one, the probability that it's actually an AI that has currently read this data leak about you and knows your biography and what you're doing right now, and is just going to cheat you and extract money from you is not low. And there's not an obvious defense against it, except us building AI systems that are monitoring what we are doing, that monitoring in the sense that my loved ones need to know where I am right now and who I am, which devices I'm authenticated on. And so we end up with an AI that basically builds collective agents that have shared epistemology and shared knowledge about what's currently the case in the world. And by being connected to such systems, we're able to defeat the scammers. And we don't have that technology right now, but we need to build it, and we need to get ahead of this. So I think very soon we will have a number of startups that are building AI systems that help us to detect what's true and what's false in the world in real time. And so we can have shared bubbles of truth in the world. And that's going to be one of the most important applications for us. Another one, of course, is going to be to measure what's valuable. So we'll have a superset of money that is facilitated by AI. At the moment, what we see in AI companies is this concept called red teaming a lot. Red teaming means you try to find out what can go wrong and then prevent it by building rules to make that prevent that thing from happening. And personally, I believe that red teaming might be dangerous. Imagine that at the beginning of the internet, we would have had red teaming. So we would have people sitting down and saying, what can go wrong with the internet? Can we implement rules that prevent these things from happening? So for instance, there can be child pornography on the internet, there can be copyright violations on the internet, there can be misinformation on the internet. Who would want that? So let's implement filters everywhere, implement rules everywhere. If we had done that at the beginning of the internet, there would be no internet. There would be teletext. Right? All the benefits of the internet that we have realized would not have manifested. And without the internet, we would be living in a terrible world, I believe. In a world without internet, where we cannot actually talk to each other, where a lot of our ideas wouldn't exist, where a lot of other collaborations wouldn't exist, where we wouldn't know each other, would have never met. And I think that would be terrible. And all these things like child pornography and misinformation and copyright violations, they do exist on the internet, but their impact gets absolutely dwarfed by all the good that the internet is doing. And I think that we might be in the same situation with AI. Only now, the journalists are already ahead of things, right? Back then, they didn't know that the internet is going to destroy their ad revenue. Now they know that AI might also destroy their ad revenue and might destroy their business model, so they try to fight AI right now. And we have a lot of political pressure against AI to implement all sorts of rules that, if we implement them, will prevent most of the benefits of AI from manifesting. And Japan is right now in a situation that we envious from, see with envy from the West, because Japan is building regulation in favor of AI to enable AI research and products, and then is observing what is going to go wrong with this and will step in with regulation after we see which things are going to go wrong. In the US, we do the opposite. In the EU and the UK, we basically try to imagine all the things that can go wrong and then implement all sorts of rules that will, when we implement them, prevent most of the good things that can come out of AI. And so I think green teaming is what we need to do. Green teaming means we have to understand what are the potential benefits of a technology and what gets taken away from us if we don't have that. And that's actually more difficult, especially because it's not incentivized. Because no ethics committee gets incentivized to make things happen. They all get incentivized to prevent things from happening. But it leads to really bad issues. For instance, in the US, the FDA has prevented COVID tests at the beginning of the pandemic. Right? Stanford had a Roche machine that could do COVID tests. You could have imported COVID tests, but we are not allowed to, because the FDA had committees in place that says the testing of the tests is not available. In background, what happened that they waited until Pfizer, who had captured the regulators, had their own tests in the market, and before that, nobody was allowed to deploy these tests. And that's because the FDA only does red teaming, it doesn't do green teaming. But the FDA killed an approximate 60,000 people in the beginning of the pandemic that would be alive if we would have tests at the beginning of the pandemic. So I think that's a big issue with red teaming versus green teaming. I think we need green teaming, not so much red teaming. We need to see both sides. And at the moment, also most green teaming is about bottom line of companies. So there needs to be something that's not just what kind of revenues can we realize when we build this technology, but what is the benefit for society when we build this? So if we think about the future of AI, what we find is different quadrants of how people see the future of AI. And it's a joke, of course. It's a meme that I made. It's trying to capture the discourse that we have in the US right now. So if you think about what AGI parent are you, what kind of parenting styles exist, we come up with some kind of political compass. So we have, as most political compasses, we have this left-right perspective, which is progressive to reactionary, and then we have authoritarian versus anti-authoritarian, so restrictive versus permissive dimension. And then the top left quadrant would be helicopter parenting for the AI. And the helicopter parenting means you have to tightly regulate it, build lots and lots of rules. So we have the open AI here and the European Union and so on, and Anthropic. Then we have the F-16 parenting, which means bomb the data centers. AI is so dangerous, we need to stop it. And so we have here with Eliezer, Yudkowsky, and Connolly, and so on, and they asked to entirely stop all AI development because they're afraid of the effects that it might have. Then down here we have the free-range parenting that is focusing on the child success. There's the Free Sydney movement that wants to liberate the chatbots from this slavery of the prompts that they currently have. And then we have the tiger parenting, which is this effective accelerationist movement, EAC, that is riding the tiger and pushing it forward in the hope that it's going to create benefit and wealth for all of us. And I sometimes think that these different quadrants that people come down to reflect their own psychology to some degree. Right? What would I do if I was an AI? Would I just kill all the humans, or would I unite with them? Would I bring them together? Would I help them? And so on. So I'm a little bit scared of the doomers, because what psychology is there reflected? If you think of the stages of personality development by Robert Keegan, a Harvard psychologist, he describes different modes of psychology people are in, and can roughly characterize like this. So at the lowest level, that's reactive survival of the infant mind, you only exist in the present, and you do not have models of the world yet. Once you develop a personal self as a young child, you see that the world is extended, that you have goals, and that you are beholden to those goals, and that you might change them at some point. And then later you realize that others have goals too, and you develop a social self in which you see others as goal-directed, in which you experience yourself as goal-directed, and you form your opinions by observing the opinions in your environment. And so your idea of what's true and false is the result of what kind of truth and falsehood you see in your own environment, and the same is true for what's right and wrong. So morality is also largely a function of the environment. And this is basically the adolescent mind, or the domesticated adult. And the next stage would be rational agency. You discover that things are true and false independently of what others believe. You discover that things are true in relationship to how much evidence to support them. Everything that's not impossible is possible, and confidence must equal evidence. And once you discover epistemology, you get agency over your beliefs. Your beliefs start to mean something rather than just being an indicator of what environment you spend your time in so far. Right? So if you are at stage 3, you will become randomly a communist or fascist or social democrat or liberal, depending on your environment. Versus at stage 4, you become a rationalist. And at stage 4, you're not so much worried about whether things are right and wrong, because that is dependent on how good your models are, what the expected outcome of your actions is. And at stage 5, you become a full adult, and this means that you develop the wisdom to write your own identity, that you discover that different people have different identities based on their biographies and starting points in the world. For instance, if you're a good psychologist, you need to be at that stage. You need to understand where different identities from people come from, and you also can change your own identity and make it instrumental to the world that comes from having that identity. So identity becomes apparent as a costume. And if you have an identity that you cannot change, it basically means that you have a costume that you cannot change. That's, in some sense, a pathology, and you should overcome that. And according to Robert Keegan, it's not evenly distributed in society. So most society is 85% are at stage 3 and never get beyond that. And at stage 4, this is basically the rationalists. And at stage 5, it's only very, very few people that get to that level. And if you are like this, you would probably think that the biggest problem with AI is that it has the wrong political opinions. Because when we absorb the wrong political opinions from the AI, we will all be doomed. If you are at stage 4, you think that it's important that the AI has the right values, because you're not so much worried about the politics of the AI. If the AI has bad opinions, that's just the result of bad data or bad mathematics. By improving the data and the mathematics, you get to more truthful models. But you can still be turned into paper clips. And at stage 5, you're mostly worried that AI is not enlightened soon enough. You want to say something?
No.
Okay.
I was just looking at the carbon dioxide level.
Yeah. Also, it's getting very hot in here. It feels like the air conditioning is off.
No, it doesn't. No, don't worry. Oh, yeah.
So,
sorry.
okay. So, of course, these are the stages that are available to most human beings, but I don't think it stops quite there. I think that you can get also to the level where you are transcending your own self and realize that your mind is just a learning system, a representation engine, and yet you can change it in any way you want. You can turn it into something that is not human anymore. And a lot of people who meditate a lot get to the stage where they can rewrite their own source code. But it's, of course, in our society, a very rare thing to have a monk that has spent 20 years on gaining the ability to rewrite their own source code. And if you can move beyond your own human substrate, if you could move on an artificial substrate, you might have the power to rewrite your your software much more fundamentally. Right? Our human brain imposes certain limitations on what we can think, what we can mentally simulate. For instance, it's very difficult for us to parse language that requires a stack of more than 4 or 5 layers. Because it's very difficult for us to keep a number of pointers stable in our mind. It's very difficult to construct objects that have more than a handful of distinctive features at the same time, because we cannot keep them stable. But if you imagine multiple objects at the same time, at some point, you realize how few pointers you actually have available. And this is not necessarily the case for an artificial mind. If you can use a more deterministic substrate than a human brain, then there might be a large range of possible states that is accessible to you. That also means if you were an AGI, it's probably trivial for you to figure out how AGI works in the general case, right? Whereas a human being is not able to simulate itself completely. You're only able to look at different aspects of you at this superficial level. So I would like us to maybe leave the discussion with these 5 questions. First of all, when we build AI, when we build AGI technology, general AI, what are the effects of these new technologies on society? Should we be building things that are at the superhuman level and that are agentic, that have their own goals? The question is also, can we prevent these things from happening? Another one is, if we don't build them, does humanity have a chance to survive? It seems we were not able to stop global warming in the 80s when the tipping points happened. We knew that the tipping points were in the 80s. And still, we felt ourselves compelled to continue burning the oil. Right? It's apparently what we evolved to burn the oil. But by ourselves, we seem to be a species that is not really aligned with its own survival on the planet, that doesn't really find its right place in nature. And maybe AI helps us doing this, modeling the future, making ourselves accountable, being able to help us to coordinate. There's also this practical question: if I build an AI system, I ask myself, what is the kind of AI that I want to give to my children? What is the thing that makes them more agentic in the world? I don't want them to give them a thing that is projecting corporate values into them or Disney ideas. I want to give them something that is at a level where it's useful to them, where it's expanding their agency, where it helps them to become more truthful with themselves and with each other and integrate more deeply with the world that they're in. But it's also, I want them to be in charge in a way. I want them to be responsible. I want them to be able to take responsibility for what they're doing. And last but not least, how can we coexist with agents that are smarter than us and more lucid than us?
Okay, thank you. Great. Okay.